I'm Tom Gaylord, and I'm going to show you how to mount an airgun scope. Modern technology has made scope mounting fairly easy, but there are a few tricks you need to know, and I'm going to show you all of them. First, we have to break airguns down to their three major power plants. We have pneumatic, CO2, and spring piston. Now, pneumatic breaks into other groups like multi-pump, pre-charged, but don't worry about that because all the guns operate similarly as far as scope mounting is concerned. And we can lump CO2 guns in with pneumatics. So really, we're talking about guns that run on compressed gas or air and spring piston guns. And it's the spring piston guns that'll give us the most concerns. Before we get into the mounting, I want to show you a few things that you need to think about when mounting a scope. First is the mounts themselves. Airgun rings or mounts come in two types. One-piece rings, which are, well, one piece, and two-piece rings. And I bet you can figure out what those are. Two-piece. One-piece rings are not as flexible as two-piece because as soon as you position the rear ring, the front ring is automatically positioned. It can't go anywhere else. And that limits your flexibility as to where the scope itself can be positioned on the rifle. Two-piece rings allow you to position the rings independently, and that gives you a lot more flexibility. Plus, there are types of rifles like repeaters that have circular clips where you're going to need two-piece rings to get around the circular clip. The one-piece ring, having a connecting bar in between, just isn't going to work. And when I say one-piece ring, I mean one-piece mounts because obviously the one-piece mount has two rings on the mount. Mounts also come in 1-inch and 30mm diameter. And that diameter relates to the diameter of the scope tube that they have to fit. This happens to be a 30mm scope tube, so I need 30mm rings. But if it were a 1-inch tube, I'd need 1-inch rings. You really can't see a big difference between the two, but 30mm is larger. There are other sizes in the world, but as far as American airgunners are concerned, 1-inch and 30mm is about all there is. Mounts also come as fixed, which means the rings don't move. Whether they're one-piece or two-piece, once attached to the rifle, the ring remains solid. Or adjustable. In this one-piece adjustable, the ring itself can be adjusted up and down and from side to side, giving us a lot of latitude if the barrel doesn't happen to be lined up with the scope base on the gun, and that is the case more often than not. However, adjustable mounts are much more difficult to mount correctly than fixed mounts, so I recommend trying to use a fixed mount if you can and only going to adjustables if you have to. I said I was going to talk about spring piston rifles. Well, let's do that. Some spring piston rifles, like this Chinese gun, have a plate right here. And what you do is put the 11mm mount in the grooves cut into the top of the rifle and slide it back until it contacts the plate. That plate keeps that rear mount or the back of the one-piece mount from moving. Air arms guns, most Weihrauchs, and BAM guns that copy Weihrauchs have three vertical holes in the back of the dovetail cut into the top of the rifle. They accept vertical stop pins from the scope mounts, and they will slide the rear mount or the back of the one-piece mount into one of these three vertical holes. Once the pin contacts the back of the hole, that keeps the mount from moving and provides a positive lock scope stop. RWS Diana rifles already have a scope base on top of the rifle, but that base has two problems. The first is the holes that are cut in it are not adequate for vertical scope stop pins, and those pins will rip out the holes in a rearward direction over time. The second problem is this base does not slant downward, but the barrel does. As a result, it's very difficult to sight in most RWS Diana rifles because they tend to shoot so low you use up all your scope adjustment, bringing the impact up to the crosshairs. So Leapers has come out with this new base that clamps on to the existing base on the rifle that quickly. All you do is then tighten 3 screws on the side of the base. The recoil shock shoulder, which is in the front of the base, contacts the front of the rifle's base and does not permit movement. After that, it's a very simple step to slap on a Weaver ring and fit it into one of the holes on the new base, and you'll have a mount that won't move. Now let's mount the scope. I picked the Avonex Renegade, which is a PCP rifle, to mount a scope to, so we won't be worrying about any scope stops, but you've already seen that and understand how it works. The rest of the mounting situation is exactly the same. The Avonex has an 11mm scope rail on top of the gun, so I'm using 2-piece mounts or rings to fit to that 11mm rail. So the base of my mounts has to be 11mm, like we learned. The scope I'll be using is a Leapers 3-12 by 44 mini squat scope. So it has a 30mm scope tube. Consequently, I have to use 30mm rings. So 2 of the things we have to select on rings, the base of the ring, 11mm, and the diameter of the ring, 30mm, those 2 things are defined for us by the rifle and by the scope. All I've done here is I've hand tightened the screws of the 2 rings, and I'm going to show you why you want to use 2-piece rings more often than not. This rifle has a 6-shot revolving cylinder that pops out right here. If I used a 1-piece mount, there'd be a bar across here and I wouldn't be able to pop this out very easily. So on guns like this, you have to use a 2-piece mount. Here's the scope. We just lay it there, and it slides back and forth, but it doesn't have very much movement. So I'm going to loosen that front mount and slide it back just a little bit. This mini SWAT scope has a very short tube, and there's not a lot of play in it. And I'm going to want some of that play for my eye relief so I can get my scope set up correctly for me. I'll show you how that works in a minute. All right, scope is on. Now I'm going to install the cap screws. There are 4 of them per scope cap, and there are 2 scope caps, so that's a total of 8 screws. We'll come back when I have this job done. There, the front cap is on. The scope is not tight. As you can see, I can rotate it in the rings. And that's on purpose because of what I'm going to do next. Now I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to fit the scope to my eye, and I'm also going to level the scope reticle. So I'm going to pick up the rifle, mount it to my shoulder, and look through the reticle, and I can see that it is not level. So I'll rotate the scope, and what I'm looking for is the vertical crosshair, the one that goes up and down, to bisect the rifle. I'm leaving both eyes open so that I can see this. Scope's going to have to come back just a little bit because it's too far forward. That's another reason I left those rings loose. That's much better. Scope is level. I'm now going to tighten the rings. This is a procedure I want you to remember. You don't have to do it with 2 screw caps, but with 4 screw caps you do. I'm going to tighten the front right cap. And notice I'm using the small end of the Allen wrench. I don't want to tighten it all the way. I just want to tighten it a little bit. And then I'm going to go to the other side of that same cap, but I'm going to do the rear screw. I haven't touched the other 2 screws on that cap. Once that's snug, not tight, but just snugged up, I'm going to go to the back ring and I'm going to do the right front screw, just snug. And then I'm going to do the left rear screw. Oh, that was already tight. All right, I've tightened 4 screws. There are 4 more to tighten because each of these caps has 4 for a total of 8 screws. So now I'm going to go up and I'm going to tighten the right rear screw, just snug, and the left front screw on the front ring. Now I'm going back to the back ring and I'm going to tighten the right rear screw and the left front screw, just snug, and that one also is snug. Now I'm going to go back to the front again and I'm going to tighten that right front screw a little bit more, and it doesn't take much now because it's almost tight. And I go to the left side and I tighten the rear screw. Then I go to the back ring, I tighten the right front and the left rear. And now I go back and I'm going to do the other 4 screws. I do the right rear, left front, right rear, left front. And now I'm going to go around all 8 screws and just check and see if there's any more tightening that needs to be done. And there isn't. And this is how you tighten screws on a 4-cap ring. It's the same way that you would tighten the main bearings on an engine. It's a method of stretching the metal down over curved surfaces so that everything ends up with the same tension on it. Okay, the scope is tight. Did you notice that I didn't put a torque wrench on or a cheater bar and walk out 8 feet and really tighten these things until they turned blue and started to smoke? I don't want you to do that either, because most of these mounts are made of aluminum and you don't have to get the screws that tight. These are steel screws with steel threads in an aluminum mount. They pull the threads inside the mounts, and that's how they achieve their tightness. So you don't have to make them absolutely as tight as they can possibly be. I didn't even use the big end of the Allen wrench. I only used the small end. That's all it takes. Now I'm going to check by holding the rifle up and looking through. Yes, my scope is perfectly centered vertically, and it's also the right distance from my eye. Sometimes, this is rare, but sometimes you'll find the scope will actually turn a little bit as you're tightening up the rings. It happens when the rings are way out of whack. When that happens, you have to loosen all the screws and go through the procedure all over again. But it doesn't take that long. Do it right and your scope will last forever. Do it wrong and you'll dent your scope tube and probably break the scope. In this segment, I've shown you how to put scope mounts on a rifle. I've shown you how to put the scope on the mounts, how to tighten down the caps, and how to position the scope and then torque all of the screws. It isn't any more difficult than what you've seen. The next step would be to sight in this rifle, and that's what we're going to do in the next segment. Thanks for being with me today, and I hope you've gotten something out of this.